This video will explore a proposition of value, but more specifically, we are going to be looking at building the affirmative case for a proposition of value and also building the negative case for a proposition of value. This is particularly important for our upcoming debate related to proposition of value. So it will tell you exactly what the requirements are for the affirmative case and what the requirements are for the negative case. So let's go ahead and jump right in to the affirmative case. So in building the affirmative case for a proposition of value, first we must look at the objectives for the affirmative case. So the objective of the affirmative case is to establish a prima facie case that provides the highest degree of probability, giving those who rendered the decision good reasons to accept the resolution. So the burden of proof essentially rests on the affirmative's side. There are 5 requirements the affirmative must follow in building a case for a proposition of value. So first, let's discuss the requirement to provide a satisfactory definition. We talked about this weeks ago, like weeks and weeks, I think, for chapter 4. But a reasonable definition of terms is necessary for any debate so that you, your audience, and your opponents know exactly what is being discussed. In our class, it is required that both the affirmative and the negative agree on definitions and terms. However, it is typically under the affirmative's jurisdiction to decide what the key terms are and the definitions for them. However, that may not be the case for our class specifically. Now let's look into number 2, requirement to provide a satisfactory criterion. So criterion offers a measure of the values and a method of comparing competing values. How would you measure a term, for instance, like value? What do we mean by minimum wage should be increased? Value and increase, for instance, are particularly vaguely worded and could mean a number of things. You'll notice the more we get into our debates, how being too ambiguous could really harm one side more than the other. So it's important to be very, very clear while discussing this with your opponents as well as your partners. Next, number 3, we have a requirement to provide application. This is the measure of effect in accepting the value or concrete implication of the value. More specifically, you are looking at the impact. Who does this impact and how does it impact them? You may find that selecting topics and material that relate specifically to your audience can strengthen your arguments and the overall application. Number 4, we have a requirement to prove the intrinsic. The affirmative must demonstrate relationships between certain elements of the case. For instance, in arguing the U.S. citizens have a right to privacy, one would need to explain why a right to privacy is important and possibly relate this issue to constitutional rights. Then finally, we have our final requirement, which is showcasing the significance. Tell us why there are harms. Why do we need to enact change? We would not have a value debate or a policy debate if there were not differences in opinions. So the affirmative must tell us why we need to enact change in the way that we're thinking, in our values, and our beliefs. And you're essentially going to tell us what are the harms. Why do we need to enact change? Now that we have discussed the affirmative case related to a proposition of value, let's dive into the negative case and the different requirements we are looking for in building the negative case for a proposition of value. So we just discussed 5 requirements for the affirmative. Let's dive into what the objective of the negative case is and the actually 7 requirements that we're looking for a proposition of value for the negative case. So the burden of rebuttal actually rests on the negative side. The negative has the obligation to refute at least one of the issues of the affirmative, or the affirmative will prevail. The negative has to attack the case that the affirmative presents. So if you are on the negative end, you may see this more so as a negative because you don't know the different arguments. When we get into policy, you won't know the different plan that the affirmative will have in mind. But usually the negative does have the burden of rebuttal and it rests on them. And with that, there are different requirements for building the negative case for a proposition of value. So first, the negative must attack the topicality. This is where the negative could argue against the affirmative's misuse, misrepresentation, or inaccuracy of key definitions or key terms. The negative could argue that the definitions or description or examples of the definitions are unreasonable interpretations of the propositions. So, though you may agree on the definitions, for instance, with your opponents and with your partners, the negative still has the opportunity to say, hey, this is not what we are actually looking at. So you may find flaws within the affirmative's examples or their misuse of examples, for instance. Next, the negative must attack criteria. So the negative might decide to offer reasons the criteria initially presented are flawed or dangerous. The negative may also create a counter criterion to establish this. The affirmative could argue, for instance, that freedom of speech is of the utmost importance, while the negative could argue that freedom of expression is. This helps to poke holes in the measure of values as well. Next, we have must attack significance. So the negative's objective is to minimize the significance that the affirmative presents and must prove that some of the elements of the affirmative case is not necessary or essential to enact said change. Next, number 4, the negative may attack uniqueness. So the negative's objective here is to prove that at least some of the essential elements of the affirmative case are not unique to the resolution. With this in mind, they attempt to argue against the affirmative case by suggesting that one would not need to obtain or adopt the resolution or change in value, possibly comparing the issue to other issues even. Next, we have that they may attack application. So the negative tries to prove that the value by the affirmative will not resolve the problem, or at least resolve the problem in its entirety. It will not necessarily create a positive outcome, or that the application overall could not be upheld. This is where the negative could argue that those involved or impacted, for instance, would be harmed. Next, number 6, we have that they may attack solvency. Here, the negative would argue that even if the application functions as the affirmative desires, it would not solve all of the problems or achieve things implied by the value advocacy. For instance, if the affirmative does provide a plan of action, which is not typically in a value debate, but it is possible, they could state that the plan would not work. Finally, we have our 7th element, which is that the negative must or they may provide value objections. So the negative may also choose to argue that there will be undesirable consequences from adopting the affirmative's case. For instance, if the affirmative advocates something as simple as money can buy happiness, the negative may look at the consequences of this value. For instance, embedding such beliefs within children and the consequences of relying on money as a source of happiness could cause more harm than good to our society. So I hope in diving into the proposition of value and looking specifically at the affirmative and negative case and kind of breaking down chapter 12 and 13 a bit, this will help for your second debate. If you're on the affirmative end, look at the requirements, look at the 5 requirements that are listed here. And then if you're on the negative, I would highly advise that you look at the different requirements and possible areas that you can attack on the negative end for your proposition of value. If you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to email me, and I will see you all in the next one.